Good afternoon. We are on the record in case number 2021-127, the electronic application of Rhudes Creek Solar LLC for a certificate of construction for an approximately 100 megawatt merchant electric solar generating facility and a related 138 kilovolt non-regulated electric transmission line approximately 1.5 miles in length in Hardin County, Kentucky. My name is Amy Cubbage. I am Vice Chair of the Public Service Commission and Vice Chair of the State Board on Electric Generation and Transmission Siting, and will be presiding today. Please note for the record that Commissioner Mary Ann Butler is recusing. Chairman Chandler is unfortunately unavailable and will be reviewing the record afterwards before a decision is made. Joining me today via video conferencing are the other four siting board members. They are John Lyons, Deputy Secretary of the Energy and Environment Cabinet, serving as proxy for Secretary Rebecca Goodman. Sydney Montgomery with the Cabinet for Economic Development, serving as proxy for Interim Secretary Larry Hayes. Mark Hinton, ad hoc appointee, and Larry Waddell, second ad hoc appointee. At this time, please set any cellular phones to silent mode or turn them on. Due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic in Kentucky, we are hosting this hearing via video conferencing. Since this continues to be a learning experience for all of us, here are a few suggestions. In addition to that cell phone reminder, these tips may help with clarity and avoid feedback issues for the video conference hearing. Please mute your microphone if you are not speaking. Attorneys, when interjecting, please state your name so the video record is clear. If you use a phone for audio and a computer for the video, turn off the audio, otherwise there will be feedback. If you are in a room with several people on their own computers, turn off the computer audio for all but one computer, otherwise there will be feedback. If another participant is in a nearby office, close the door between the offices. If you're using headphones, wired are preferred because wireless devices tend to lose power when you least expect it. At that same count, keep a charger nearby in case your battery runs low. And please alert the siting board if you are experiencing a technology failure that prevents your participation at any time in the proceedings. Attorneys should contact staff using the previously supplied contact information. Again, the hearing today is for the purpose of taking evidence in case number 2021-127, the application of Rhudes Creek Solar LLC for a certificate of construction for an approximately 100 megawatt merchant electric solar generating facility and a related 138 kilovolt non-regulated electric transmission line approximately 1.5 miles in length in Hardin County, Kentucky. At this time, we will have the entry of appearance of counsel. Given the unique challenges of conducting a video hearing, please also identify any witnesses you have brought with you at this time. First, for the applicant.
Good afternoon, Vice Chairman Cuppage and members of the board. My name is Todd Osterloh, along with me, Jim Gardner, counsel for Rhudes Creek Solar with the Lexington law firm of Sturgill, Turner, Barker, and Maloney. We anticipate having 6 witnesses today. Robin Says is the Vice President of Development, who will be talking about the company and the project, kind of a high level for the project. Jeff Chang is a planning and engineering manager who will be able to talk a lot about the studies that have been presented to the siting board and a lot of the planning. Alex Gregory is an EPC manager who will be able to talk a lot about the construction process if there are questions on that. Michael Savage is a consultant with Pond, and he produced the no basic traffic study that was filed in December in this matter. Dr. Paul Coombs did the economic analysis report that was filed with the application, and Richard Kirkland prepared the property value analysis that was also with the application.
Thank you, Mr. Osterloh. For the siting board.
Linda Gosnell, Your Honor.
I have been advised that public notice has been given and filed in the record. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and I believe that was given on January 5th, 2022, and filed in the record the same day. Is that correct?
Yes.
That is correct, yes.
Okay. Are there any outstanding motions?
I don't believe there are.
Okay.
No.
Well, we're going to move on to the public comment phase. Request to provide the commission with public comment must be requested prior to the start of the hearing and no later than 30 minutes prior to the start of the hearing. The instructions and email address to send any requests are located on our website at psc.ky.gov. Have we received any requests to make a public comment?
Yes.
Okay. Have there been any written comments previously filed?
Yes, there have been, prior to today, around 39 public comments filed in the record that have also been supplied to the siting board members. We also have comments shown in the record from the public meeting on January 10, and there was another set of comments filed this morning.
Okay. Just for anyone watching, written comments may always be submitted to the email address located on our website at psc.ky.gov. If you provide written comments, please provide your name, address, and the case number, along with your comment, and the case number again is 2021-127. With that, we will go ahead and take our oral comment that had been requested. We have, I believe, on the telephone line, David Broderick, who would like to make a comment in this matter. Mr. Broderick, are you there?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. My name is David Broderick. I'm an attorney in Bowling Green, Kentucky at 921 College Street. I represent Hardin County Citizens for Responsible Solar, which is a large group of concerned citizens in Hardin County, as well as individual property owners that are either adjoining, contiguous, or near the surrounding area of this application. Many of whom, and we thank you, were able to make public comments on January the 10th and have filed written comments, all of which we ask you to consider because they address a variety of matters, but particularly as it relates to Public Service Commission, it relates to the change of the use of this land. This is primarily, historically, agricultural land that is now going to a different use. Quite frankly, what you are being requested to do is to approve a power plant in the middle of a significant agricultural, if not the best agricultural area in Hardin County. We have seen the application. I will tell you, had the citizens been able to respond sooner, we would have moved to intervene. We recognize that that time has passed 30 days after the application. However, we want our public comments to be considered specifically as it relates to the change in the use of the land, the absolute lack of mitigation matters that have been presented. In concluding, and I appreciate the opportunity to make these comments, and I won't belabor all the various comments that have been made, but they're all sound reasons. We have a situation that will devalue the value of land on the surrounding property owners. And finally, the local planning and zoning authority, which is the Board of Adjustments, has not granted nor heard this land to be appropriate land for a conditional use permit. So for those reasons, we ask the commission to take all these comments under consideration in hearing the proof that's presented, and we thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Mr. Broderick. We appreciate that. Mr. Osterloh, are you ready to present your evidence?
Yes.
Okay.
And our first witness will be Robin Says.
Okay. Mr. Says, I hope I'm saying that right. Could you please raise your right hand? Okay. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct under penalty of perjury? Can you say yes or no? I think I just kind of...
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
I'm sorry. I feel like I'm back in private practice in a deposition instructing people to say yes or no rather than uh-huh. I don't mean to be flip, I promise. Could you please state your name and address for the record?
Yes, ma'am. Robin Size, 777 Brickell Avenue, Suite 500, Miami, Florida, 33131.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Osterloh, you may ask your questions.
Thank you. Robin, by whom are you employed?
IBV Energy Partners, that's IBV.
And what is your title with IBD?
I'm the Vice President of Business Development.
Okay, and can you provide a background to the board about what your role is with this project?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first, I am co-founder of the company with IBV Energy Partners, and I was, involved with the beginning of this project when we first started looking at Kentucky, from whether it's land acquisition to development of the project, permitting of the project, the origination, selling the power for the project, and then also in the transmission interconnect process.
I think we can hang up the line.
I mean, I got it on mute. It's not me.
Give us just a second. We'll get our IT people in.
I don't know what that is. Is it coming on your phone too, or just this one?
It's,
I don't know how to turn it off. I can mute it, but that's just me. Thank you. Well, that was not as hard as it looked. Sorry.
it's okay.
I
You
did
ready
not
to go
cause
back?
that to go on. Please, please don't think I did.
Oh, no, it was just the quirk of the line. Okay, sorry about that. Feel free to go back as far as you want.
Thank you. So maybe Robin, if you could just provide a little bit of background of the company that you co-founded.
Yeah. So IBV Energy Partners, I'm co-founder of the company. We founded it back almost 5 years ago now. Timothy Kim and I, who's also co-founder of the company, he's a Navy veteran. I was an Army veteran. We worked at a previous company. We hit it off. Similar values and work ethic, and we wanted to start a company where we could take that and build a culture around some of those values and ethics, and build something that was what we called at the time a lean, mean fighting machine that we started back then. A little bit of that integrity and mindset, bringing what we learned in the military. So we founded the company to be a utility scale solar developer. Plus, we also do battery storage in projects where we can. And we want to be competitive in the utility scale solar market. And to do that, our business model is to build, own, and operate projects. So we understand our PPAs, power purchase agreements with utilities and off-takers, are typically anywhere from 10 to 20 or even 25 years in some cases. We want to be good stewards in the community, good partners with the community, and we founded the company to be that way. Now, it takes a lot of money to start a solar development company, especially on the utility scale. We needed some help to do that. And so Tim had a previous relationship when he worked in the banking industry with a company out of Berlin, Germany called IB Vogt, V-O-G-T. And so we approached them with our business plan and what we wanted to do, and they built projects all over the world. They've got over 1.5 gigawatts of projects that they built. They operate, I think at this point, 3.5 close to 400 megawatts of projects they do in O&M, and all over the world, from Egypt, the Netherlands, Philippines, Australia. So they've got a global footprint, but they didn't have anything in the U.S., so we approached them about a model here where they would fund us to start development here. They agreed to do that, so they essentially provide us our development dollars, and then we go develop, and then we do our own financing for projects that get realized and come to fruition.
And am I correct that IBV's model is to own and operate these projects?
Yeah, that's our full intent, is to develop everything greenfield and take it from soup to nuts, from first development of the land to take it through to PPA, originate our projects, sell the power, build them, do the operations and maintenance for the long term of the project lifecycle. That's right.
Great. And with respect to Rhudes Creek Solar and the PPA that's been entered into, can you provide us any more with some background on that?
Yeah, so LG KU set out to do a RFP for solar energy. I believe it was back in early 2019. We received that RFP. We decided to participate in that. So now found land site, and we felt was suitable, and we actually won the RFP. In negotiating the PPA with them, we've come to find out that PPA supplies 50 megawatts to Toyota, 25 megawatts to Dow Chemicals, and the other 25 megawatts of that 100 megawatt PPA is used for their own retail use.
Great. So then maybe you can just provide a high-level background of the project that you're planning.
Yeah. So it's a 100 megawatt project, AC, and it's we've got a little over 1,000 acres of leased property, of which I think it's 11 parcels make up that 1,100 acres. Now, at the end of the day, when we construct the project, it's not the whole 1,100 acres, it's going to be about 750 acres that the project actually gets built on, with a 1.5 mile long radial line to the point of interconnect where we're there. And that transmission line's planned to tie into LGKU's grid system. And the project itself, under 750 acres that, we will fence in that. We also want to keep some of that agricultural use. So we're working with the local community to have sheep grazing on the property and do those operations to help with operations and maintenance. Also, the seeding of that for the sheep, we want to work with the local community with something that's friendly to the sheep, but also bee pollinators that we want to have involved in the project. So we keep some of the agricultural fields of that. We want to do that as much as possible.
Great, thank you. And I'd like to switch gears to maybe talk about some of the recent developments that has gone on there locally in Hardin County that we haven't had a chance to update the record on. One of which is the planning and zoning process. So I think we responded to a data request, the first set of data requests in November. After that time period, the Planning Commission held a hearing in December, correct?
That's correct.
And that hearing was for the approval of the zoning map amendment, correct?
That's correct. We were changing from rural residential to R2 to an agricultural A1 designation.
And did the Planning Commission reach a decision at that meeting?
Yes, they did. They voted unanimously to approve.
Okay. And subsequent to that, you attended a couple of public outreach events. Can you provide a little background to the board on those two events?
Sure. So I obviously attended our own, but also some of the local communities there held an informational session in, I believe it was early December, late November, early December. I went to where they had set up stations to provide information about solar from the standpoint of local landowners. And I went to that to go listen, not to go engage, but just to listen to what the comments were, what concerns were. And to that note, we made a commitment from the beginning of this project to be transparent and open with the community, to work with them on their concerns. And so we've done that at many living room and dining room tables around the project. But in hearing that informational session, a lot of questions came out of that. So we had our own informational session after that. I believe it was December 16th. Where it was an open Q&A, not a booth type session, but where people could come in and do an open Q&A with us. We did a short 30-minute presentation on the project overview, and we wanted to leave as much time for Q&A as we did. We had about 90 minutes of Q&A with that. I want to say about 50 people showed up, and we recorded it, so we have a recording of that as well.
Okay. And going back to the local approval process, following the Planning Commission's approval of the zone change, the Board of Adjustments had scheduled a hearing on the conditional use permit. Is that correct?
That's correct. That was scheduled for actually the beginning of last week, January 7th, or at the end of last week, January 7th. Yeah.
I think it was last Thursday, the 6th, wasn't it?
Yeah, I'm sorry, the 6th.
Okay. And what happened earlier in that day? What kind of notice did we get?
Well, we all got there when we were ready to go. There was a snow event coming into town. It was supposed to be like 1 to 3 inches, and as the weatherman said, it was an overachiever of a storm. And I think in Elizabethtown they got close to 7 inches, and the county, I think, was a great decision, decided to cancel that meeting that day for safety purposes.
Okay. And in discussions with the planning director, it's my understanding that they've rescheduled that application for the conditional use permit for a hearing on March the 3rd. Is that your understanding as well?
That's correct. I believe the email we got says we are confirmed for March 3rd.
Okay. And I guess switching gears again, I'd like to ask a few questions prompted by a submission to the siting board yesterday, a letter sent from the county deputy judge executive. It actually appeared in the record maybe an hour ago. It was filed in the record. And you're aware of that letter, correct?
That's correct, yes, sir.
And actually, the deputy judge executive, Daniel London, called you yesterday in advance of him submitting that. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's correct. He said basically he wanted to do a clarification for the record. So he called me about that. That's right.
And that type of communication is not uncommon with county officials, correct?
That's correct. Since we started here back in, I want to say April or May of 2019, as we met with county officials, also landowners, et cetera, we want to foster good relationships. So whether it's the planning and zoning staff, or the judge executive's office, or the Department of Transportation within the county, Elizabethtown, everything, we try to be transparent and foster open communication, but relationships and mutual respect where we can address concerns and we can hear concerns and have an open line of communication.
And in terms of what Mr. London indicated to you was the catalyst of that letter, it related to a quote from Dr. Paul Coombs from his report, correct?
That's correct. That's correct. So, and I believe it was the timing of it. It was December 20th when that was filed. And go ahead.
Well, and actually that's what I want to touch on. The December 20th filing, looking back at the record, is actually the filing of BBC Research and Consulting's independent consultant report, correct?
That is correct.
And so BBC referenced Dr. Coombs' quote in their report, correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
And do you recall when Dr. Coombs initially did that report?
Yeah, that was in summer. I want to say that was in the June timeframe of 2021 when that was done, and it was based on communications that we previously had with the county when we were looking at a possible IRB pilot. That was early in the year when we had those discussions, and basically it was left at that until after we get our permits.
And so did the company provide Dr. Coombs with that information as to what you anticipated the project benefits, the pilot agreement to be?
Yes, absolutely, that's correct. So we've been provided that information early on in 2021, and so that was the last data set that we had from what a pilot IRB would potentially look like. And so that was the latest data we had, but like I said, that was from early 2021.
Okay. And it's my understanding that several months after Dr. Coombs prepared his report in June, you would have had more discussions with county officials regarding the pilot and maybe negotiation. Okay.
Todd, you broke up there. Could you say that again? I'm sorry.
Sure. My apologies. Several months after Dr. Coombs prepared his report in June of last year, it's my understanding you had communications with county officials regarding the pilot and an interest in pausing discussions or negotiations. Is that fair?
That's right. Earlier on in 2021, we decided, look, for the county to work on this, they've got to spend some money on it, and for us to negotiate this out, we've got to spend some money. Let's pause on all that till we get our permits. Whether it's the county level with CDP or state level, let's pause that until we get our permits, and then they're open to talk with us about it, pick it back up after that, or even if we want to seek state level where it's KEDFA or whatever the best avenue might be. But we'll pick it up at that point.
And you agree with me that that's consistent with Mr. London's letter that's submitted into the record?
That's exactly right.
And it's still fair to say that the company is receptive to a pilot agreement that can be reached with the county?
Yeah, we are dedicated to working with the county. If that's the best route, then they're open to it. But at the end of the day, with all that, we want to make sure that we're doing right by the county. Obviously, the project economics have to work for us to make this work and meet our pricing points with LGKU. But we want to make sure that the schools are taken care of and that we're doing right by the county.
Great. Thank you, Robin. Vice Chairman Covich, I believe that's all the questions I have on direct.
Thank you. We will now go to staff.
All right, I have just a few questions for you, Mr. Says. The letter in question indicates that Hardin County is not negotiating a pilot agreement or an industrial revenue bond at the present time. Is that right?
That's correct. At the present time, we're not negotiating.
And I may be required to ask Mr. Coombs about this, but has Mr. Coombs been asked to review his projections on economic impact on taxes as a result of this letter?
At this time, no, we don't have an alternative plan to ask him to review. We will pick that up after we get through the permitting process.
In your application and in your responses to data requests that Rhudes Creek has made, there have been several mitigation efforts indicated. For example, you've got a stormwater pollution prevention plan with various requirements. You've got proposed 8 to 5 pile driving time period. You've got a 300 feet setback from equipment where there's a visual impact. So there's many different situations in which you've discussed mitigation efforts. Is Rhudes Creek still committed to following the various measures that are contained in your application and in your responses?
Yes, sir.
Now, Rhudes Creek has also reviewed the report of the consultant for the siting board and proposed, or rather submitted a letter in which they discussed his proposals for mitigation. And it appears, if I'm correct in interpreting this, that basically you agree with the mitigation measures suggested by the siting board's consultant, with the exception of an issue with regard to when there will be a vegetative planting. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. That's correct to my knowledge. I will say, I think when we get further into our testimony, I think Jeff Chang and Alex Gregory might be able to answer that portion better than I can.
I'm sorry, who could?
Jeffrey Chang and Alexander Gregory.
All right, I'll ask them about the particulars of that mitigation measure as well. That's all the questions I have for this witness.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Secretary Lyons.
Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Sayers. Just one follow-up question, and perhaps you said this and I just didn't hear. The power purchase agreement, what's the term of that with AULG&E?
The 20-year term?
20 years? Okay. And generally, just for my education, what would happen at the end of that 20-year term, given the life expectancy of the solar array is longer than that? Would that just be to re-up with AULG&E, or what would you expect would happen at that point?
Yes, sir. That is an option. One of the I would say the main option is to sign another power purchase agreement with LGEKU, and or at that point we might be able to sell into the market in a different manner. But I would say another power purchase agreement, because all the infrastructure is there. It's all usable. The expected life of the panels and the infrastructure is much longer than that 20 years.
What is the expectation, the life?
35 to 40 years.
Thank you. That's all I have, Vice Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Montgomery.
Good afternoon. Mr. Saz, I've just got one question, and it's regarding the potential sheep on the property. Would there be any jobs created from that, or is that simply just maintains itself? Thank you.
Yes, sir. I'll tell you from the census that Dr. Coombs has, right now there's only 38 sheep in Hardin County at the last count. To maintain 750 acres or 1,000 acres, whether it's inside the fence line or outside as well, it's going to take many more head of sheep. So from that alone, I believe you're going to have more job creation as we open up that industry, so to speak. But Dr. Coombs, I don't know if he's got more information on that or not. That wasn't in the scope he originally studied for us, but going from 38 head of sheep to potentially a few thousand head of sheep is going to create more jobs.
Do you have anything else, Mr. Montgomery?
That's it. Thanks, Vice Chair.
Thank you. I don't see Mr. Hinton or Mr. Waddell on right now, so I will go ahead and ask my questions. Good afternoon again. Thank you for being here. I was going to ask you about zoning. That's been addressed. It makes sense that that conditional use hearing was postponed, given I know that the band of snow that went along the Elizabethtown area was incredibly heavy. So we understand that. I do want to follow up a little more about the IRB and pilot discussions. The letter indicates that they didn't wish to negotiate or consider these agreements pending further consideration by planning and zoning. Has there been any discussion that they would be open to negotiation, assuming you do get all of your zoning permissions in order?
Yes, ma'am. So essentially, it's get through your permit, and then let's start talking about it again at that point. So I think, at that point, there's opportunity to negotiate and get there, but also for us to explore other avenues through the state or KEDFA as an option, either in lieu of or in addition to in some way for incentives. But definitely everything on hold until after we receive our permits.
Okay. Well, and that anticipates my next question, since they do refer to relaying to you that they strongly prefer that you explore alternatives with KEDFA. Can you discuss what those alternatives might be, and if you've had discussions with KEDFA?
Very preliminary. We have an attorney that's exploring that with them on the side right now. He's not on this call, but it's extremely preliminary. So honestly, I don't know what that looks like just yet, as there's a lot in the works. And I think maybe even in the state, as far as state level programs as well, that I think are changing.
Okay. Most of my questions are going to be more appropriate for Mr. Chang or Mr. Gregory, so I won't go through each one of those and have you say I'm not the right person to answer it, but I do want to ask you kind of a more big picture question, and I think you may be the best person to address it. You may have been watching, I don't know if you got to see the public hearing we had on Monday evening down in Elizabethtown on the project, and there is quite a bit of, at least at the public hearing, unhappiness about this project and its location expressed by members of the Cecilia community. Could you go through some of the efforts you've made to address any of those specific concerns, and what you might do in the future to try to address some of those very, very specific, very site-specific concerns?
Yes, ma'am. Our first public outreach, other than talking with landowners for site control, our first outreach was a town hall type meeting back in, I would say, October of 2020. And we sent certified letters to all the residents that live within 1,250 feet of the site at that time. And we had 27 folks show up to that town hall, where we gave them a briefing on the project, and we also started taking their comments and feedback, but also contact information so we could do follow-up meetings, one-on-one meetings. But sometimes people will come to a town hall like that and they don't want to speak freely or tell how they really feel. So we wanted to follow up with folks, and so we started then doing one-on-one follow-ups in people's homes, in their living rooms, at the dining room table, to talk about specifically what concerns them and work with them on mitigation measures, whether it's setbacks or proper vegetative buffering, and how to do that to address noise concerns, misinformation that's out there, because if you can Google anything on the internet and find 2 stories to every side, where we wanted to present them with real facts and information that's true on subject matters that involve our industry. So again, 27 folks showed up to that. I would say between Jeffrey Chang, myself, and Nathan Coleman, who's a land agent, works for us, we visited with probably 7 or 8 who requested follow-ups to go and talk with that. Where we feel like on setbacks, as an example, where we started out was at 75 feet off the property line or off of a road, where one specific example with one family, I believe it's the Tall family, where we moved back our fence line and also our solar panel first string of solar panels back to it's on the other side of a topographical feature where that provides better buffering, but also we can put the vegetative buffering on a hill that, really does a great job of screening the project and moves it back further from your project. Obviously, what that presents for us is there's land there we're not using that's in the fence line that, is a hit to the project, but we're committed to working with the community to do things like that so that we can address their concerns. So that first meeting happened in October of 2020. The next one we held, and then we held the one-on-one meetings between then and April. April 1st, we held the second one where we mailed out again letters to get folks to come in, and we only had, I believe it was 7 or 8 folks show up for that. It was kind of some of the same folks and a couple of new ones that showed up, but we committed with them again to work with them on whatever their concerns were and how we could do it. Even things that didn't involve us. So we have one landowner who's got an issue with some flooding on his property. It has nothing to do with us. That's in the county right away. And we worked with him through some of our contacts at the county to get the county to come out and clean out some of the ditches that are by the county road that have helped to, didn't completely solve this problem, but helped alleviate that. We've continued that process from the beginning of the outreach through this week. Jeff Chang was out with two of those landowners to work through some of those issues and how we can mitigate their concerns. And we were committed to continuing doing that.
Okay. I know, and I know Mr. Chang and Mr. Gregory can discuss this more specifically, but I know a lot of the concerns have surrounded the issue of stormwater runoff. Have you had discussions with any of the neighbors regarding stormwater issues?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. With multiples of the neighbors on what that situation is now, with row crops that are planted on the property that we have leased that we're going to build on, and what the improvements are going to be once we come and we plant grass seed. The grass seed that will be involved with sheep. There's a seed mix called Fuzz and Buzz that take root, and it's much better from a soil erosion and a stormwater runoff perspective, where it should and it will improve the overall scenario and situation of stormwater runoff that they currently deal with.
Okay. And again, I know we'll be talking probably to Mr. Chang about the karst issues. Some of the other board members will chuckle to hear me already bringing up karst, since that's kind of my pet issue. Just generally, has your company ever built in a highly karst area?
I have personally, I have not done with this company. At a previous company near the Tallahassee airport in Florida, we dealt with karst.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. So from the expertise standpoint, in-house, we do have experience with that. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Mr. Lyons, before I go to Mr. Osterloh, did you have some, because you looked like you maybe had something there for a second. Did I misread your face?
No, other than a little bit of humor, Vice Chair, that I was probably going to steal your thunder on the karst issues.
Okay. Okay.
I was going to wait hang on that. So.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to make sure I gave you a chance to ask if you had anything else before we turn it back over to Mr. Osterloh. Thank you so much, sir. Mr. Osterloh, do you have any redirect?
I do not.
Okay. I'm assuming that Mr. Says will be staying and he doesn't need to be excused?
That is correct.
Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks. Ready to call your next witness?
Yes, Vice Chair. Our next witness is Jeffrey Chang.
Okay, Mr. Chang, you can turn on your camera and microphone and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct under penalty of perjury?
I do.
Could you please state your name and address for the record?
Jeff Chang, Planning and Engineering Manager at IBB Energy Partners, and address 8609 Southampton Drive, Raleigh, North Carolina, 27615.
Thank you. Mr. Osterloh, you may ask your questions.
Thank you. And Jeff, can you identify who your employer is?
It is IBB Energy Partners.
And what is your title with IBB?
I am the Planning and Engineering Manager at IBB.
And can you explain to the board what that means with respect to this project?
Sure. So it's kind of a interface role that looks at the development and engineering of our projects. It works with the finance team to kind of interface those multiple aspects of project development and ultimately provide a smooth transition over into the execution phase, which is my colleague Alex Gregory, who's on the call, and sort of going from the development and detailed engineering through to procurement and construction of the project.
Great. And we've had a little foreshadowing of, I guess, questions and topics to discuss, some of which came from public comments. So maybe starting with the karst. Can you provide some information to the board as to the evolutionary process that the company's had in considering karst issues there for this project?
Sure, I appreciate the question and sort of talking through the genesis of looking at karst. I would say it really started back in February 2020 when we met with the county planner and the county engineer at the time, who has since been, I guess, who has since retired and has, there's a new county engineer in place, but that was one of two things the county engineer at that time had really brought to our attention were, number one, really staying 25 foot outside of the banks of blue line streams, and then number two, staying out of karst. To my knowledge, there's not any standards set by the county on setbacks or anything like that from karst other than to keep out of them, and they are certainly a large concern throughout the community as well as for many parts of the state of Kentucky. And so that was sort of the start of it. And as we've gone through the iterative development and design process in various stages, we have essentially built out constraints for karst that do exist on site. And those namely come from two areas of the work that we've done regarding specifically the karst, and that's number one, really using the University of Kentucky's survey on existing karst throughout the site. Luckily, from that standpoint, there were rather few on that, but we've also done field observation throughout the site with our geotech engineer, A&S Geo, to go out and map out karst throughout the site and establish where those boundaries are, and ultimately provide us recommendations from a development and design perspective to address those additionally identified karst. And ultimately what we came to is for those areas of high karst, we actually established an additional 100-foot setback to stay out of those from the development of I guess, designing panels and certainly some of the heavier equipment such as inverters and transformers.
And that 100-foot setback, it was part of the recommendation in the final geotech study it's on file with the siting board, correct?
That's correct, and part of the deliverables that was provided by our Kentucky PE at A&S Geo was to provide a constraints map that we could incorporate and integrate into our design of the plan.
Okay, moving to stormwater. Can you maybe describe, let's start with, do you anticipate the project negatively impacting the stormwater in the area?
We do not, and that's primarily because there's very little concrete and really minimal increase from the standpoint of impermeable ground cover. I think for the most part the panels are on driven steel piles as opposed to concrete pads, and that was certainly one of the major concerns that we had gotten from the county engineer from a stormwater perspective. There's been quite a few other items regarding stormwater from the standpoint of, can we limit disturbing the existing elevation and grading to say 200 to 250 acres, so as not to create a vast land mass of disturbed area, and that's something that we've certainly looked at from a execution standpoint, is phasing the project so as to limit the amount of disturbance that we're creating at any one time before, say, stabilizing and moving on to the next area. We have essentially conducted a detailed hydrology model in looking at various drainage areas throughout the site and seeing, where those drainage area outflows are, and looking at existing pre-development conditions and post-development conditions, and then looking at, after the development does get constructed, ultimately what is the ability for those specific areas, those land uses to be able to handle additional runoff, and ultimately look at the time of flow from one end to the outflow of those various areas. And the majority of the site has been addressed to essentially cover those areas, and we've not seen any impact.
And we've also had public comment received about sandhill cranes in the area. In the planning process, how does the project evaluate considerations of impact to wildlife?
Sure. So as part of the permitting at the federal level, and I guess triggering a federal nexus, and working with the Army Corps of Engineers to look at the wetland impacts for JD wetlands, we have actually gone through and provided the design and the site plans for the project, and did have Army Corps do the review over the project, and they were the lead agency coordinating and consulting with the state as well as with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And as part of that process, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife did do a review on habitat and I guess threatened and endangered species, and to my knowledge, nothing did come up regarding sandhill cranes at that time.
Was there any species that came up that required further study?
Yeah, there were some bat questions that did come up, and what we had proposed was to mitigate those impacts to bat populations by contributing to the Imperiled Bat Conservation Fund.
Okay. And to your knowledge, at least, is the sandhill crane an endangered species on the Endangered Species Act?
To my knowledge, they are not a identified species, and I also believe that there's perhaps even a open season right now for hunting sandhill crane.
Specifically hunting season here in Kentucky, correct?
That's correct.
Switching gears, in response, or there was a question from the siting board staff related to underground, or any impact to underground oil and gas storage. And I believe they asked if we had reached out to any agencies. Can you provide an update on that progress?
Sure. On that, I did reach out back to our geotech engineers at A&S, and did receive a memo that I've got that has not yet been submitted on record, but essentially it was looking at and coordinating with, let me see here, the University of Kentucky, I guess, Geological Survey, as well as the Kentucky Division of Oil and Gas, to look at this, what's known as the Cecilia Gas Storage Field. That's about 0.4 miles northeast of our project, and they were looking at, what are the I guess conditions of that existing storage facility, and found that it was about 800 feet underground in the subsurface and in the limestone and dolomite formations, and ultimately did not find any impact that a solar project, typical solar projects as well as ours, Rhudes Creek, would have on the integrity of that oil and gas storage below ground. And it's primarily for two reasons. Number one, we're completely outside of the footprint. And number two, really, we're not going more than, say, 15 feet below the surface. We're doing any disturbance. It's really limited to the I guess, very top of the soil layer as opposed to where that storage exists, which is 800 feet below ground.
Great, thank you. And I think maybe just one more topic for you, from me, and that relates to our response to the BBC consultants report. And it was mentioned earlier, you had actually identified some concerns about the sequencing or the timing of the vegetative buffer. Can you explain what some of the concerns might be for a sequencing or seasonal impact?
Sure, and part of the, I guess, comments that we had provided back over in response to the consultant's report on vegetating and providing, I guess, buffers before any construction was just we were looking for some flexibility on being able to screen the site, and I think there's a number of reasons that come into play with ultimately like the feasibility of putting trees in the ground in the dead of winter. We do hope to actually kick off the project and break ground in the winter time, and that's certainly one of the concerns that come up is how viable can we establish vegetation at such an early time of the year.
Okay, and part of that is just making sure, like you say, it's viable, because if these trees die, then it's not benefiting anyone, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chang. Vice Chair, Jeff is available for cross-examination.
Thank you. Staff, you may go ahead.
Let me follow up just a bit on this issue of the mitigation measure. It looked like there were two issues that you all were concerned about with the mitigation measure proposed by the siting board consultant. One related to weather, which you've just talked about, and the other related to perhaps an understanding as to trying to screen the whole project when you've already committed to constructing in phases. I think I've stated that correctly. Is it feasible to agree, or not to agree, but is it feasible to complete vegetative screening, assuming the weather permits it, as the phases are done, rather than for the entire project? So before the bulk of the construction is going to occur in that phase, to go ahead and put your vegetative screening up, presuming that the weather conditions would permit it.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I think I'm going to have to defer that one to our EPC manager, Alex.
Okay. Are there any revisions to the site development plan dated May 21 that was submitted with your application as attachment 1?
So the site development plans that were received last year in May are slightly outdated. I mean, it has been a very iterative design process. And ultimately, I do foresee some additional modifications to happen to that as we really lock in and determine which panels and trackers we're going to be using. We've not committed to any particular supplier or vendor from that standpoint, and we're still really looking at some change of equipment and things like that, and that is currently under the works.
So there's really not at this point a finalized plan, but there is a different plan than the one that was submitted with your application.
That has not been fully drafted. It is still in sort of a work in progress, if you will.
You mentioned,
but minor changes, if any, at this moment.
You mentioned just now you hadn't yet selected your vendors on some of the equipment, so I'm going to just skip wildly forward here and ask a question about your panels. There was a glare study commission that discussed the yellow and green glare, I think with particular emphasis on the airport that was nearby. Will there be any anti-glare components to the panels that you all are using?
So my understanding is the way that these panels have been designed is really to reduce glare and in the sense that absorb as much of the radiance as possible. But additional treatment to further reduce glare is not something that we have broached with our potential suppliers for the moment.
You also produced some landscape plans as to your vegetative border. Of the most recent one that I see was dated June 9 last year by J. Miller Landscape Architectural Design. It's attachment 1 to the application. There's a list of various types of trees and sizes for buffering on that list. First of all, has there been any significant revision to that landscape plan since that application was submitted?
There has not been any significant revision to that. That still is the plan as it stands, but with the minor changes, the site plan, there will be some modification needed. We just have not asked our landscape architect to work through those for the moment. It is essentially the 5th iteration of the landscape design.
In looking through those plans, can you explain a little bit further what the width of the barriers will be and what other types of vegetation might be used to assist in a taller and wider barrier?
I don't know the exact dimensions of those, I guess, barriers or widths, but we are incorporating berms to add some additional elevation to those evergreen trees, double row trees planted at say 4 to 6 feet. Did I answer your question, or maybe you could repeat?
Partly. So you don't really have any information available at present that would give us what the width of the barrier would be once it's in its adult phase?
So yeah, I don't know that we have any, or I don't know off the top of my head the exact dimensions of those. I know that from the landscape plans, I believe there are dimensions specified on the height and the width of those berms. We've done a few visualizations on before and after, say, following installation, and then 5 years down the road, what those landscape plans potentially look like. I don't know that those have yet been submitted.
You did indicate, and I did see the height of the plant. Is that the plant that's going to be put in, or is that the plant when it reaches its full adult maturity? Do you know?
That was either when it was put in or 5 years after, depending on which picture you are referring to. But that is not the at full maturity. That has not been simulated to any extent.
In the BBC report, it was mentioned that particular attention might be spent to additional buffering for the 15 smaller lot residences because of the possibility that those smaller lot residences would have more negative impact. Would that be feasible, and could you explain possibly how you all could take that into account in your process?
Sure, and I appreciate the question. And as mentioned, this is the 5th iteration of the landscape design. We work very closely with J. Miller, our landscape architect, to work through these designs and specify the plans. And part of the reason why we've gone through a few iterations is we've had a number of individual one-on-one meetings with adjoining property owners and talk through exactly where would they like to see landscaping done in addition to our existing plans. And that's something we're certainly committed to working through as we work through the permitting and try to work through the conditional use in establishing, ultimately what are the requirements to provide landscaping and who all can we talk with in addition to those that we already have to further our design. So it is not a final design, I should say. It's the fifth iteration, but we're certainly committed to and open to meeting with adjoining property owners to discuss landscaping.
Okay, so you've already answered the crane question, so, and you've answered the Cecilia Gasfield question that I had. There was also a discussion in one of our requests for information about any distribution lines for gas that may be under the property, not related to the Cecilia gas storage field. Was that followed up on at all? That was our request number 15.
Sure, I would say from the standpoint, and I spoke with our civil engineers on this, on essentially looking through and reviewing the survey, and we've essentially established where all the easements are, existing, the public easements, I should say, but any sort of private, smaller lines that could be anywhere we've not looked at, nor do we necessarily plan to do a full-blown review of the 1,000 acres that are 1,000+ acres that are under contract. But for those public easements that are existing, those have been identified and properly addressed.
You indicated in your answers to request number 8 of our second request for information that there was no decommissioning plan yet. Do I assume that's still the situation? There is no decommissioning plan set?
There has not been a decommissioning plan submitted. There is a draft form of the decommissioning plan. However, that is not on public record anywhere or has been submitted.
You did indicate that whatever plan you had would include a requirement that all components of the solar field be dismantled or removed. Does that include anything related to the transmission line?
Yes, so we can commit to removing the generator tie line to the new switch yard that's being planned by LGK.
In its initial report, a company called Terracon Consultants, it's dated December 30, 2020, and they did some soil testing, and they found moderate corrosion possibilities from the buried portions of the project that might occur. And they asked for more testing and more evaluation. They did a second report apparently in May, at which they said the risk is low. So it was changed from moderate to low. Even so, have there been any steps taken, or can you explain if any would be necessary to avoid corrosion of any of the metal products into the ground or the water?
Sure, thanks. And maybe just to clarify, the report that was conducted by Terracon originally was a planning level preliminary geotech. And we actually then brought in A&S Geo to actually do the full-blown engineering and design level geotech, which included looking at the soil corrosivity. And what they found was that it was minimal in terms of risk to corrosivity to the steel. However, I think as we move forward with our selection of trackers and the foundation design, that is something that will be taken into account to ensure that these structures that we are installing do not have any significant issue with corrosivity.
I want to go back to the karst issue, which has been mentioned. I did have one further question on that. In the report that Terracon did, they talked about the very high karst potential that we've all talked about. today. And they mentioned that offset buffer, which you've previously answered in response to Vice Chair Covich. They did also talk about the fact that the equipment may move slightly based on the karst potential, and they recommended annual surveys at various monitoring points to make sure that the equipment is in place. Can you explain what the company would do to comply with that recommendation, or how it would be followed up on?
Sure, I think from a O&M perspective, it would be locating a few, key locations throughout the site and just doing surveys, fairly simple surveys on looking at if these particular, say, benchmark locations or monitored locations have any movement over time. But I would say from the standpoint of actually establishing a full-blown plan on that, we've not. It's been more at the high level, what would it take to monitor and how frequent.
That's all the questions I have for this witness.
Thank you, Ms. Gosnell. Deputy Secretary Lyons.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Good afternoon, Mr. Chang. I think you're fortunate. I think Mr. Osterloh addressed a lot of my questions along with the Vice Chair and staff attorney. But I did want to follow up on a few things. I think it's important to try to address public concerns and comments as best we can in these hearings to help them understand some of the issues they've raised. And of course, I'll stick to my area of expertise, which is the environmental side of things this afternoon. But just to follow up on the consultation with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, I think Mr. Osterloh asked you a question about sandhill cranes and whether they were endangered or not, and you answered you did not think they were, and I concur with that assessment. But some of the comments pertain to migration and stopover points for the birds, and as a part of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife consultation, they look at critical habitat. Did the U.S. Fish and Wildlife determine that any part of this project footprint was critical habitat or threatened, endangered, or otherwise?
To my knowledge, it had to do with the bats was the primary species that was looked into.
Right, so there was no critical habitat for sandhill cranes specifically. It was just all pertaining to the bat roosting sites. Is that correct?
Correct, to my knowledge.
Yeah. And speaking of that, I noticed the project footprint, there are at least a couple of blocks of trees that are included and that look like would be disturbed. Am I reading the project plan correctly in that respect?
Yes, that's correct. We do have some wooded areas throughout the site, and that's actually for those areas that will be cleared for the project. Those are essentially where the commitment to fund the Imperiled Bat Conservation Fund come into play is for every acreage that is removed for the project, we do need to commit a certain amount of funding towards that IVCF.
Right. And when would those areas be disturbed? Sometime clearing.
Yeah, in the permit, what we've committed to do was limit that within the October to March timeframe, so as to limit impact to, roosting.
Yes, okay, thank you. You mentioned a JD, a jurisdictional determination by the Corps. One of those was done for the site. There are a lot of streams and wetlands on this property. what was the result of their jurisdictional determination?
So they did, I guess, take jurisdiction over a number of wetlands throughout the site, and ultimately, what we did was we followed up with our design, and we discussed, what sort of impacts would we be having, would the project have on these jurisdictional wetlands, and ultimately determined that because the impacts to, I want to say maybe 5 or so of the wetlands, the JD wetlands, because they're all related to maintenance roads, they actually recommended us to proceed or go down the path of NWP 14, linear transportation projects, as opposed to NWP 50 something, I don't know the number off the top of my head, which is related to energy projects or renewable projects.
So you have to get a nationwide permit, an NWP.
That's
to,
correct.
Do those stream crossings.
That's correct.
But otherwise, you all don't plan on disturbing any wetlands or streams of major consequence. Is that correct?
That's correct, and I guess a part of that NWP 14 was the mitigation to imperil that in providing that funding.
Thank you. I did not see a cumulative environmental assessment as required under 224-10-280 in the record. That could be just my oversight. Do you know whether one of those was done or not?
I'm sorry, maybe I missed the document that you're referring to.
A cumulative environmental assessment that's required as a part of.
I'll have to go back and look at that one, but I don't know that we have one, but I can double check on that. I don't know at the moment though.
I just did not see one in the record, but it's a standard assessment that's required under the statute to assess air, water, waste, and water withdrawal impacts, if any. So if we do not have that, maybe that could be a post-data hearing request. Vice Chair, I don't know how we want to do that.
No, that's fine. We can put that on the list and do that. I'm sure Mr. Osterwald can help us out.
But while we're on that, Mr. Chang, let's just try to briefly to address what would be the expected air impacts, if any, from the construction and or operation of this project.
So I would say the 11 parcels that are related to the solar site itself total about 1,072 acres, of which we plan to fence in around 750 acres for the solar project.
So well, as far as air emission impacts, I guess is what, like dust, for instance, particulate matter, would we expect any type of emissions from that standpoint?
Outside of, I guess, the construction, the minor construction equipment emissions and kicking up the dust, I don't think that there's anything beyond that from an operational standpoint.
Okay, thank you. We've already addressed the stormwater. Obviously, you would have to apply and get a Kentucky Pollutant Discharge Elimination System stormwater permit. And I think that's important for the public to know that you will actually have to have a permit that you would abide by, not only for construction, but for continued operation there. But let's talk about the waste. I know in several public comments, there was concern about leaching of pollutants from the panels themselves. These panels do contain heavy metals. Can you address that possibility or lack thereof in terms of leaching of pollutants from the panels over a period of time?
Yeah, and I appreciate the question. I did reach out to our suppliers or the potential suppliers that we have been discussing from a procurement of panel standpoint, and they have not said that there was ever any issue when it comes to leaching of hazardous materials. So to my knowledge, there's not a risk of panels breaking and leaking into the soil and groundwater. And I should say that the panels are mostly silicon or sand, and there's no liquid within them to actually come out of the panels.
Just one final question. I should have asked this before when we were talking about the U.S. Fish and Wildlife consultation. Did your company happen to do a Kentucky biological assessment tool run? It's not required, obviously, but neither is the T&E situation necessarily from the statutes. But Kentucky Biological Assessment Tool is something that how we interact through our Office of Nature Preserves with the state Fish and Wildlife. And it's a pretty valuable tool to be able to basically tell you the same thing that the IPAC with U.S. Fish and Wildlife does, but we can also address perhaps some habitat, and Mr. Size mentioned pollinator species. Did you all do a run on the Kentucky Biological Assessment Tool?
So I'm personally not familiar with that toolkit, but I know, from the standpoint of doing critical issues in the phase 1 ESA, those might have been actually used. I just don't know to what extent, if any.
I did not see it. I saw a reference to state Fish and Wildlife, and I thought maybe that's what it might have been, but I did not see it. It's something you all may want to do in terms of determining pollinators. This area could be in some former prairie land area that has specific species that different pollinators other than what you just might generally get from a native pollinator species. We might be able to suggest better species that not only be better pollinators for the area, but also provide some of that vegetative viewshed blocking that might be important to the folks. So just an idea there that y'all may want to follow up and do that. It's on our website, through our Office of Nature Preserves. That's all I have, Vice Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary. We've been going about an hour and 20 minutes. I normally hate to interrupt a witness's questioning, but if Mr. Osterloh has no objection, I think it might be good to take a break for about 10, 15 minutes for everybody to stretch and take whatever breaks they need. Any objection, Mr. Osterloh? Okay. Well, why don't we recess and come back at 2:30?
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, we are back on the record in case number 2021-00127. We're going to resume the questioning of Mr. Chang. Are you back from the break yet, Mr. Chang?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thanks. Just a reminder, you're still under oath, and we'll go to Mr. Montgomery.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I have no questions for this witness.
Okay, great. Now it's my turn. I will try not to be too scattered, but when you ask questions last, it tends to end up that way. So I apologize if I sound like I'm a little all over the place. The first thing I want to ask you about are actually some of the other types of utilities, and I use that word broadly, that are crossing the property. And the first one I want to ask about are railroads. I know there is a rail line that is crossing part of the project, and I think maybe even crosses one of the access points to the property. Have you all met with the railroad or discussed any issues the railroad might have, particularly with respect to that crossing?
Sure, and I appreciate the question. That has been the Paducah Louisville Railway Company, I believe is the name of it. They do have a Class 2 rail line that does run through the eastern section of our site, and that has been something that we've discussed with them for I would say the better half of a year. And we're actually working through the crossing agreement as we speak. We have submitted an application for crossing and utilizing the existing private grade crossing that currently exists. So when I say crossing, there's the at-grade road crossing as well as the underground wire or cable crossing.
Okay, so there's currently an application pending, and, okay. Just want, because I know that they can be difficult in some of these projects, so I just wanted to make sure, particularly with the road crossing.
And I'll say they've been wonderful to work with for the record. So
Oh,
we're working with their asset management firm, actually. It's the company Omega Rail that does manage their assets. So.
Okay. I also notice, I don't want to make this a guessing game. What I am looking at is Figure 2 in the critical issue summary. It's what I would almost call a desk review. That looks like it was done early on. And in that Figure 2, it shows the railroad crossings. It also shows on here a Mid-Valley Pipeline Company and a Bluegrass Pipeline LLC pipelines that also run under this property. Can you tell me a little bit about those and any issues or coordination there may have been with those companies?
Sure. This was a previously owned Sunoco pipeline, gas line that runs sort of from the south to the north through the site and in the direction of, I want to say, northeast, southwest. And I was just on a call earlier this morning with our permitting specialists and discussing next steps for that. And there has been a level of coordination with the gas company, Energy Transfer, who's acquired that line, and I do have a call with them next week. So there are ongoing discussions on crossing the gas line again from a medium voltage, low voltage cable crossing, as well as access or maintenance road crossing. So above grade and below grade, we are expecting. And at the moment, because we have not finalized our equipment selection, we've not gotten into the detailed medium and low voltage design, which would be quite pertinent in determining those exact locations of those crossings. So that's kind of where things stand with that gas line that exists through our site.
Okay, how deep are those lines under the site? Are they on top of the ground?
They're below ground, and that is something that we do want to discuss in more detail with the company on exactly where for say the length of the pipe that exists on our site, we'd like to understand, what the range of depth, if there is any range there.
Okay. Do you have any idea right now? I mean, are you thinking it's fairly shallow, or could this be fairly deep?
I believe it's fairly shallow, but I don't want to quote any number off the top of my head that I'm not aware of, but I believe it's fairly shallow.
Okay. Now I will turn to, let's talk birds. I know there's been a lot of discussion about the cranes, and I know the cranes are not an endangered or threatened species, but you mentioned in discussing that you had coordinated with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and there had been some assessment work done. Is there any written document that U.S. Fish and Wildlife produced? Because I saw references to the coordination with U.S. Fish and Wildlife in the record, but I didn't see any actual report from U.S. Fish and Wildlife.
So we did not directly coordinate with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. It was Army Corps of Engineers that would have done the direct consultation with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. I can look back to see what we have on that and see if we can provide that. Okay.
And I know that in addition, we've again talked a lot about the cranes, and we've talked about endangered species, but in your critical issues analysis, there's also references to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and several birds that are believed to be species of concern within the project area, but there's no assessment of any issues regarding their breeding season. And for each of them cited in there, not each of them, but many of them cited in there, they do appear to be in the project area during breeding season. Has there been any assessment or discussion with Fish and Wildlife or any other entity specifically about these Migratory Bird Treaty Act issues and impacts on these species?
We've only briefly discussed that internally from the standpoint of, if there is indeed breeding that is found during the execution phase of the project, we will certainly look at and determine what the proper mitigation would be if those worms are on site. But I actually don't know whether or not the Migratory Bird Treaties Act has been discussed in any detail with U.S. Fish and Wildlife.
Okay, but it is on your radar, and the company does plan to review that and mitigate any impacts. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. In that same document, there is quite a bit of discussion of farmland and the concept of prime farmland, and the fact that the vast majority of this is prime farmland. And I know that's been a huge topic of discussion from the public comments and concerns about losing prime farmland here. So I want to make sure I understand the terminology and what we're talking about. First, in that critical issues analysis, and you don't have to have it in front of you, but if you want it in front of you, you're welcome to have it pulled up. On page 6, there's a discussion of the soils, and there's references to both prime farmland and farmland of statewide importance. What do those terms mean? And if you aren't the right person, who would be to explain that to me?
I don't know that we have the right person on this call or this meeting today, but that's something we could certainly follow up on.
Okay, do you have even a lay understanding of even the difference between the two? Because I've heard a lot of discussion about prime farmland, but I haven't ever heard the term farmland of statewide importance. Do you know what that means at all?
Outside of it being more of a strategic, these are, lands that are important for the ag industry in Kentucky. I can't say that I can speak any more to it.
Okay. As far as the layout of the site, do you know, I know you said or it has been said today, I don't remember if it was you or Mr. Says, who said it, that only 750 acres of the site is actually going to be what I would call under panels. Do you know if there's been an effort in that? Is that because of missing wetlands and karst, or is it an effort to preserve some of that prime farmland, or some combination of all of it?
I would say, when it comes to the actual farmland, what we would like to do is try not to utilize the areas that have bad terrain or wooded sections. And so I would say it's mostly to the land constraints as opposed to preserving the farmland, because the site is primarily used for agriculture.
Okay. And then in that same section, and this is on page 8, there's some discussion of the Farmland Protection Policy Act, which is a federal law. Do you know anything about that law and any restrictions on use of conversion of prime farmland? Can you discuss that at all?
I apologize. I don't think I'm the right person to discuss that one either.
Okay. There are also some discussions of, and this may be more for Mr. Gregory, of a possible need to remove part of the topsoil to put in some subgrade stabilization. Would that be a question more for Mr. Gregory?
I mean, I can speak to that from a design perspective. It's the limitations of the trackers and the required elevation or slopes of the site. And I would say for the most part, the good thing about solar is we try to keep, change in elevation or I guess modifying the natural topography as much as possible, but there are certainly acute areas where we might see some interference with the trackers, and that's been primarily the locations that we focused on from a grading standpoint.
Okay. And again, I do apologize for the jumping around. The reference I'm talking about is in the ANS Geo report. It's in section 9.3, and it's talking about subgrade preparation. And it may be that this is not an issue because you're not going to be doing this. But at the beginning of that section, it states that prior to the installation of shallow concrete foundations, ANS Geo recommends over-excavating the subgrade by at least 6 inches, lining the exposed material with a geotextile separation fabric, and bringing the subgrade back up to the design foundation elevation with compacted structural fill. Is that something you all are planning on doing?
I would say this is for the foundations for the trackers and the modules throughout the site. It's mostly the H-driven H-piles or steel piles in the ground. And from that standpoint, the soil conditions and from a lateral and linear perspective, it actually is very good for driven piles and providing that stability for the panels. However, for say the roads, the maintenance roads, as well as the inverter stations, the substation, those smaller areas throughout the site, we have discussed with ANS, how could we ensure that those foundations are stable for those particular areas, and I guess, beyond just the foundations that you're talking about, as I mentioned, it's the road design, and there are some soft or wet spots that we've looked at closely and come up with some cross-sectional design to address that, and at times that does talk through or recommend excavation of existing soils in those locations.
Would you be able to give me any kind of rough percentage of what part of the site might be subject to this excavation work?
I would think less than 5%.
Okay. I know we've talked a lot about karst, and I'm pleased to hear that you all are committed to the setbacks. Having grown up in this general area, I know that stuff falls in pretty regularly and easily. On one of the, I believe it's the ANS report, they indicated that they believed additional investigation was going to be necessary. Has any more karst investigation been done, or are you awaiting a final site plan?
We are actually planning some additional geotech work, and that has been discussed with ANS, and I would say that's particularly related to the transmission, so the project substation, the gen tie, and the switch yard.
Do you have any concerns about pile driving in karst?
We do not. So for the majority of the site, we actually have been quite lucky in the sense that there's not, there's not so many cars throughout the site, and for those areas that do have the cars concern, that's where we are staying away from driving piles.
Okay. Did you consider, I know at least one project in a karst area has come to us with an alternative ground-mounted system that just uses essentially these long screws. The good part is there's no pile driving, but the bad part is you wouldn't be able to have sheep grazing under it like is proposed here. So was any sort of alternative racking system explored here, or only the pile driving?
I would say only the pile driving, just because the soil conditions are actually quite conducive for H-pile foundations, I would say. So that we've not considered other foundations, nor do I believe we anticipate looking at other foundation options. We think that this is truly the most, I guess, cost efficient and design from a design perspective. It certainly is the standard when it comes to installing solar. You only really look at those specialty items when you do have some major foundation design concerns, but for this site, it's as mentioned, very conducive for this particular foundation design.
Okay. Skipping around again, and this is back to, I believe it is the critical issues document. There is one map, it's figure 5, that shows 2 nature preserves that are fairly close, that I'll admit I was not familiar with until I was reviewing this document. The Springhouse Barrens State Nature Preserve and the Eastview Barrens State Nature Preserve. Do you know if you've analyzed any particular impacts on those nature preserves here?
We've not done any additional analysis on impact to those nature preserves, but I think we're of the belief that we don't have an impact to those nature preserves.
Okay, can you give me just a general idea of what these preserves are used for?
I think it's primarily for recreation in the area.
Okay. And then that same map shows an agricultural easement is marked on there. It looks like it is about 2 miles to the north of the site, and it's on the other side of State Road 86, it looks like. Any analysis with respect to any effects on that agricultural easement?
No, there has not been. If it is not on site, we've not assessed it for impact.
Okay. It appears, and again, this is that same critical issues report, and in figure 3, it's an aerial photograph of the site where there's 3 serial aerial photographs that show the site that are pieced together. It appears like there is a residence smack in the middle of one of those sites that is within the fence. I'm assuming this is a participating property, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. So there's no issue with impacts to this because they've signed contracts with you?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. think I am about done. Give me just a second to look through my notes here. Oh, one more question, it's about the driveways. And you discussed this in the request for information response. I believe you have at least discussed with Hardin County or the state all the requirements for any of the new entrances that you've considered and have those approved at this point, or at least have the design specs you need for approval?
Yeah, so regarding access to the site, both for the state road and county roads, there's really, I guess, 86 or Hardinsburg is the state road. And on that one, we have had the District 4 engineer come out a number of times with his colleague to look at site distances for that. They've provided us the information and also recommendations from a soft or wet ground perspective, how to design those, and discussing requirements from a culvert standpoint. We have not actually filed the application, but that is something that we have been in touch with them about and are working towards getting those applications in for the state. And then on the county level, we have discussed both South Black Branch as well as Hardinsburg Road, where those are the two county roads that are directly adjacent to the project. And what we were told was essentially that Hardinsburg Road is too small of a road, and they would like us not to utilize that road to any extent. And so that's something that we've committed to doing for Hardinsburg Road, or I'm sorry, Hansborough Road. I apologize, I'm getting my road names mixed up. And then for South Black Branch, that's the road that we would be utilizing that is owned and maintained by the county. And what we ended up doing there was essentially going out and flagging the locations of the existing driveways that we wanted to utilize, as well as flagging the proposed driveways that we'd be adding for the project. And after site visitation, the county did come back to us and actually said two of these roads do not meet site distance requirements, and so we did provide some additional offset and sent that back over to the county for review, and were provided the okay for those locations. But like the state roads, we've not actually submitted any applications for those. It just is more at the design preliminary level of, do these roads work from a site distance safety perspective.
Okay. That's the last question I have. Thank you so much, Mr. Chang.
Thanks.
Mr. Osterloh, do you have any redirect? You're still muted.
Todd, you're on mute.
Thank you, yes. You would think after a year and a half of this, we'd be used to it, or 2 years now. Thank you. I do have one question, just following up, Jeff, with what you were saying. I just want to make sure the record's clear, because maybe I misheard you, but you were talking about Hardinsburg Road as compared to Hansborough Road. Hardinsburg Road is roughly an east to west road there, at least on the side, Highway 86, which is the larger of the two roads, correct?
Sure, maybe I can clarify that one more time. The state road, or KY 86, also known as Hardinsburg Road, is the road that runs east to west and has been discussed with the Transportation Cabinet. And then South Black Branch, which runs sort of northeast to southwest, is a county road that we'd be utilizing for access to the site and adding driveways and utilizing existing driveways. And then Hansborough Road, which kind of runs, I want to say, southeast to northwest, is the county road that we've been asked not to utilize for the project.
Thanks. I just want to make sure that was clear. That's all the questions I have.
Appreciate that.
Does anyone else have any other follow-up?
Vice Chair, I do, just one, you made me think of it. Mr. Chang, I noticed in the phase one site assessment, there reference to several older buildings, many of which are in the project footprint. Are there plans to demolish those buildings? I don't know exactly where they exist in terms of where the solar arrays would be, but has there been an overall assessment of all those buildings and what will become of those?
Yeah, I would say for the most part, those are being preserved. There is one older farm building that is accessible through KY 86, and that's actually where we would like to plan sort of the construction headquarters, if you will. There is existing water as well as potentially existing electricity that could be used. So sort of from that standpoint, we would like to preserve the buildings that are already throughout, and then utilize areas that make sense to, from a sort of construction headquarters standpoint.
And you also brought something to mind when you talked about water accessibility. Were there 5 or 6 water wheels on the property, or did I misread that somewhere along the way?
No, that is correct, and a part of that was meeting out with the landowner and talking through and looking over a map and marking some locations throughout that had water that the landowner said that we could use for construction and maintenance.
Would those wells be maintained after completion of the project?
I think if they were utilized, we would certainly address how to utilize them and ultimately how to maintain them if they're used for the O&M of the project.
Okay. Just a note of caution there, if they're going to be abandoned, they have to be properly plugged or capped in accordance with Division of Water regulations. So just a note there. Thank you, Vice Chair, that's all.
Anyone else have anything further for Mr. Chang? Okay, I'm assuming Mr. Chang will also be saying he doesn't need to be excused, but if that changes, just let me know. Now, Mr. Osterloh, you may call your next witness.
Yes, our next witness is Alexander Gregory.
Okay, Mr. Gregory, if you could turn on your camera and microphone and raise your right hand. And do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct under penalty of perjury?
I do.
Okay, please state your name and address for the record.
My name is Alexander Gregory, Senior Manager, EPC Operations. I live at 5406 NC State Highway 86 in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, 27514.
Thank you. Mr. Osterloh, you may ask your questions.
Thank you. Alex, by whom are you employed?
I'm employed by IBB Energy Partners.
And what is your title there?
I am Senior Manager at EPC.
And can you provide some background to the board on your background, actually, in the solar industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a project management background. I've been in solar since 2012. I've installed or managed nearly 1 gigawatt of utility solar across 8 states. My background in solar actually, Strata Solar is a large utility provider in the state of North Carolina. Actually partnered with the community college in my local hometown, so was able to get some experience, some hands-on experience. I was able to actually earn an internship through that partnership and program. And I started in the field as a temp laborer, making $7 an hour. So certainly came in as green as they've come, as new as you can be with no experience. But was able to work my way up through the field and was able to be hired on a salary and work my way up to into a management role that I sit here today. So,
And can you describe what your role is there with IBV?
absolutely, yes. So I oversee EPC, which is for field engineering, procurement, and construction. So I oversee all of the on-site construction activity, and that includes safety, quality, procurement of materials and services, as well as subcontractor management. So I am on the delivery side, if you will, of the IDV team.
Great. And I know Jeff Chang provided some responses as to design elements related to stormwater. I'm hoping maybe you can elaborate on what you do to monitor stormwater when construction is going on.
Absolutely. So what my team does as far as on-site management, we perform daily inspections that are scanned, emailed to my team on the quality side. We also store those locally. So we do daily inspections of all of the BMP features, any of the stormwater features, and then we also do a formal report once a week or after a major weather event, which we consider over a quarter inch in a 24-hour period. So that's just the base kind of coverage we have for stormwater BMP inspections. And those are standards that are throughout the industry that we've adopted and built on.
Great, thank you for that response. Vice Chairman, I believe he's ready, or he's available for cross-examination now.
Thanks. Ms. Gosnell, any questions?
I believe they deferred to you on the screening question, Mr. Gregory. There was a question earlier, I think you were present, concerning when the vegetative screening can be put in with regard to when the construction is. The consultant for the siting board had recommended it be put in prior to construction, and then there was a response filed by Rhudes Creek saying, well, that might not be feasible or isn't feasible. So my question had been to Mr. Chang, which I think he deferred to you, is it feasible to do the vegetative screening prior to construction of each phase rather than the entire thing? Now, that would be, of course, weather permitting.
Yes, Vice Chair, thank you for the question. For the construction phasing, I believe that's an additional step the development team had agreed upon to minimize disturbance of the soil. So I have no issue, my team has no issue with vegetation buffer kicking off during the initial construction phase. And this is not an activity where we'll be disturbing the land or using large heavy equipment. So I really don't see any issue with rolling out with the veg buffer for the entire site as soon as we break ground. If that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. We've already talked about the railroad a little bit, but my question relates to whether you all are going to have to use the actual railroad to bring in any components, such as the substation components or any of the heavier components. That was discussed a bit at the site visit, so I was hoping to catch up and see whether there'd been any further information on actual using the railroad tracks to bring materials.
No, Vice Chair. I know Jeff's team has worked closely with the railroad, but currently we are not intending to utilize the railroad logistically for deliveries. It's a creative idea, actually, but no, we will have no use for that.
Okay, I had several questions about the traffic and noise study, but I see that I believe Mr. Savage is here from Pond and Company that did that report, so he's probably the one I should ask about those questions. So I don't have anything further for this witness.
Great, thank you, Ms. Gosnell. Mr. Lyons, or Deputy Secretary Lyons, excuse me.
No questions for me, Vice Chair.
Okay. Mr. Montgomery, any questions?
No questions for me, Vice Chair.
Okay, and I surprisingly have no questions. So any redirect, Mr. Osterloh?
No, ma'am.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Gregory. Mr. Osterloh, you may call your next witness.
Yes, Michael Savage.
Okay, Mr. Savage, if you could please turn on your camera and microphone and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct under penalty of perjury?
Yes.
Okay, and please state your name and address for the record.
Michael Savage, 1200 River Place Boulevard, Suite 600, Jacksonville, Florida, 32207.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Osterloh, you may ask your questions.
Michael, by whom are you employed?
I'm employed by Pond and Company.
And what is your title there?
There I am an associate and project manager.
And you assisted with the preparation of the noise and traffic study that was submitted with this application, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. The noise and transportation impact assessments associated with section 4 and 5 of the SAR, and also with regards to 278 3D KRS.
Okay, and maybe before we get into that, you've been a consultant for other solar projects, correct?
Yes, that's correct. Over 1 gigawatt.
Okay, and that's in a variety of contexts, not just impact to roads and noise?
That's correct. Yeah, all of the environmental components from wetlands, delineations, listed species, noise, visual, all that good stuff.
And I'm hoping maybe just with that background, you might be able to shed some light on some questions that have come up earlier, more from a general perspective as opposed to site specific. But can you elaborate on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and how it might impact this project?
Yeah, so the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is it's a federal regulation between most of the countries in North America, basically designed to protect migrating birds. There's an expansive list of what those species are. It's different than the Endangered Species Act. And it's only triggered when there is a federal nexus, like federal grants involved or federal permitting. When there is federal permitting involved, like the Corps of Engineers permit, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does its review not only of the Endangered Species Act, but Fisheries Acts and Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And compliance with the federal permit constitutes compliance with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. There are some measures that are put in place to make sure that there are no potential impacts associated with migratory birds, like initiating construction prior to the nesting seasons, because then typically the birds aren't going to nest there if there's already activities going on. The main difference between the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and like the Endangered Species Acts are that Endangered Species Acts, there's the term harassment is prohibited as well. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act does not do that. It allows you to keep those birds from nesting on your property, but once they're there, they're protected. And so typically, once again, compliance with the permit constitutes compliance with that act, assuming it's a federal permit. That's kind of
Great, thank you. And then there were also questions on the difference between prime farmland and I think it's farmland of statewide concern. Can you shed any insight on that?
Yeah, so they're just the difference between the federal designation and the state designation. So a prime farmland was designated by USDA Conservation Service because it had soil characteristics synonymous with good prime farmland. In addition, some states have also created their own designation, which is that farmland of state importance. And so in those instances where that's on this property, that just be and the government recognize those.
I'm sorry, you broke up there on maybe the last sentence or two.
Just essentially that it's just that the state and the federal regulatory agencies both identified if these are shown on your property, they were both identified, significant.
Okay, great, thank you for that. So back on the noise and traffic study, I think you mentioned that also included impacts on future dust and correct?
Correct.
And have you reviewed the report filed by BBC Research and Consulting that's been filed in this matter?
I have.
Is your study consistent, or the findings in your study consistent with those of BBC?
That's correct, they are.
Do you want to elaborate on any of that?
So the BBC report was actually issued the same day that our independent study was completed. Both studies essentially came out with negligible or no significant impacts to noise, traffic, fugitive dust, or rail. They came up with similar recommendations and mitigative actions that could be, that could take place. For instance, if we're speaking fugitive dust, minimizing the disturbance, smaller equipment, watering, things of that nature, which have already been, the IBB is already, or I should say Rhudes Creek is already established as acceptable to them. And so there's no significant deviation related to that.
Great, thank you, Mr. Savage. Vice Chair, he is available for cross-examination.
Thank you. Ms. Gosnell, do you have any questions for this witness?
I had just a few. In your traffic study, I believe it's, let's see, it's a table, section 3.1 of your noise and traffic assessment on page 8. And it states that the average number of cars on Kentucky 86, which is a fairly substantial two-lane road, is 9.5 and 10.5 cars per day. Am I misreading that, or is that an error?
No, that's not an error. It's just basically the difference in breakdown of the time periods being evaluated of the vehicles, potentially, cars per day is different than cars, per year. You have consideration. The KRS, or I should say the BBC report, also has different details. There's a associated with operation.
You broke up quite a bit on that there toward the end, sir. In the BBC report, you mentioned that just before your connection was a little fuzzy. He indicates 3,500 to 3,800 vehicles per day. Do you have any quarrels with those numbers?
We don't have any quarrels with those numbers.
So that, the 10 cars and 9 cars, that's not per day, that's just for some very short period of time. Okay. If you use the numbers of 3,500 to 3,800 a day, does that at all affect the conclusion of your study that there would be minimal traffic impact on that road?
No, it doesn't, because it doesn't change the conclusion that only a couple hundred additional cars is not significant when you compare it to that number.
Okay, in your noise portion of your report, you state in one portion, and these are related to the tables shown on page 6 and 7, I believe. You indicate the pile driving noise is maybe 114, and then you show the decrease when you reach 300 feet apart, and you end up with an average of about 74.4 to the nearest residence at about 300 feet away, and I assume you mean the residence, not the property line, right?
Correct. Yes.
So that term you're using, cumulative noise level, is that the same as a maximum noise level? The reason I ask is that in quite a few cases recently, the maximum noise level is higher, particularly in view of that chart of construction information that we've seen.
Yeah, so there is a little bit of a discrepancy there, and this comes into play when you choose different equipment or different materials, for instance, that you're using your evaluating point. They all have different specs. And in this instance, the BBC report identified that they felt that the independent study that was done previously had sort of underreported the noise associated with that. Cumulative means, can mean a number of different things. It can mean multiple activities going on at the same time, or it can also mean not necessarily constant. So there's a difference between, for instance, 80 decibels of constant noise and 80 decibels of cumulative noise because of the fact that it may not be constant the entire time.
So the individual in the property, the residence, say 330 feet away, if you're using that 74.4, is that constant or is that going to be intermittent then?
That's representative of what the BBC considered in their report as the constant noise.
Okay, and in your noise report, it specifically says that you did consider noise in the operational phase of the project. So
That's correct.
Did you also include any noise, or is there none, related to the operation of the transmission line portion of the project?
We did not include any information related to the transmission line in the report.
Okay, and did you include any information about the construction of the transmission line in the report either?
Did not.
Okay. That's all.
Thank you, Ms. Gosnell. Deputy Secretary Lyons, do you have any questions?
No questions, Vice Chair, thank you.
Mr. Montgomery, do you have any questions?
Just one, Vice Chair. Excuse me. You said, I guess your connection went bad for a second. When you were describing prime land, who is the federal agency that designates prime land?
U.S. Department of Agriculture, Natural Resource Conservation Service.
Perfect. Thank you. That's all I have, Vice Chair.
Thank you. Just tagging along onto that question, since you seem to know this topic, do you know anything about the Farmland Protection Policy Act?
I do.
Okay. I know that one of the documents stated that projects subject to, that this project is not going to be subject to the FPPA, is my understanding. My question is, if it were, would it get approval under the FPPA given the amount of prime farmland that's involved?
It's difficult to speculate on that without having done a thorough review and have been a party to the report that references the amount and locations of those. But that act is essentially designed to provide funding opportunities for people who continue to maintain their lands in farmland use, and takes away those funding opportunities if they are to convert them in some capacity for those that are demonstrated as prime farmland. That this doesn't really apply to this project because they're not seeking any funding or currently getting any funding, they being Rhudes Creek. It really doesn't really apply.
Okay. Do you have experience with solar projects on prime farmland?
Yes.
Okay.
Almost every project I've worked on has had prime farmland components to it.
Is, at the end of the project, and I know these are relatively new and we haven't gotten to the end of the project, there have been a lot of concerns expressed that because of changes to the property due to the installation and then later removal of the solar panels and accompanying infrastructure, that it won't be suitable as prime farmland anymore. Is that a fair characterization?
So prime farmland is a number of factors go into determining what prime farmland is, but at the end, at its conclusion, it all comes down to soil types. And as long as you're not altering those soil types, because it's looking at erodibility factors and runoff precipitation factors and things like that, as long as you're not changing that soil type from, say, whatever NRCS designated to some other NRCS designated soil type, it will remain in prime farmland because that's just the designation associated with it. And it doesn't really get into suitability. We're talking about, pile supported structures, minimal pads, activities during construction and after construction that are, in most instances, from my experience, similar to the agricultural activities that are already going on the property. In some instances, when we're dealing with, planting, taking down trees, orchards, things like that, I haven't come across a scenario yet where even after several years of installation, there's been any significant alteration of soil such that it would no longer meet that designation.
Okay. Thank you. That's the only question I've got. Mr. Osterloh, do you have any redirect?
No, ma'am.
Okay, thanks. Then you may call your next witness.
Thank you, Vice Chair. And we had planned on calling Dr. Coombs next. It's my understanding that the internet in his neighborhood is down, but I believe he's on the phone as caller number 2.
Okay.
Dr. Coombs, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes. And Vice Chair, with your permission, can we have him testify via audio only?
Yes, that's fine. It's Dr. Coombs. Yeah. Well, Dr. Coombs, wherever you are, please raise your hand. And do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct under penalty of perjury?
I do.
And can you please state your name and address for the record?
Paul Coombs, 3604 Trail Ridge Road, Louisville, Kentucky 40241.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Osterloh, you may ask your questions.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Dr. Coombs, you are an emeritus professor of economics at the University, or from the University of Louisville, correct?
That's correct.
And you are a consulting economist, is that fair?
That's true.
And did you prepare a report identifying the economic and fiscal impact of the Rhudes Creek Solar Project?
I did.
Can you just provide a brief summary of the findings of that report?
There's two major findings. One is that the construction will last approximately a year and involve about 240 direct construction jobs with a payroll of about 12 million. I used and developed a custom model of Hardin County to try to model the linkages from construction of such a site to other industries in the county to try to measure the spinoff impacts. So I estimated that the total economic impact in the county for that year would be 312 jobs total and 15.2 million in payroll. That's the main impact. That's the main economic impact occurs in 1 year. The other finding that is still, I guess, in negotiation is the increased property taxes that will go through local jurisdictions as a result of the $100 million that's being invested. We don't know exactly how that will play out in negotiations on whether there'll be a pilot or if the company will go through the state or through an incentive program. But based on other projects that I've looked at over the past year and a half, generally, the new property taxes associated with the project will be a factor of 8 or 10 times the amount currently being generated for farm use. So it could be as much as $50,000-$60,000 per year in new property taxes compared to only 6,000 or 7,000 currently being generated from farm use. So those are the two things that I looked at and made estimates for.
Great, thank you, Dr. Coombs. Vice Chair, he is available for cross-examination.
Thank you, Mr. Osterloh. Ms. Gosnell, do you have any questions for Dr. Coombs?
I might have a few, although Mr. Osterloh asked you part of one of my inquiries. I assume you're aware of this letter that was filed yesterday from the Hardin County Deputy Judge Executive concerning the fact that there is not currently in negotiation a pilot agreement or an industrial revenue bond agreement being negotiated, correct?
I'm not aware of that, but it might give you some comfort here to think about the amount of money going into this project that will certainly be taxable. There's going to be millions of dollars of new tangible property and increased real estate values, and plus a lot of machinery that will be taxed by the state. And that will be subject to local property taxes. So when you take millions of dollars of increased assessed value and apply local property taxes, you get tens of thousands of dollars more in property taxes. So that's as deep as I looked at it.
Okay, in your analysis, you indicated that you were making the assumption that there would be those things in play, and you estimated $2.35 million in additional property tax over the next 35 years, which is $67,000 a year, and you compared it to, quote, a few $1,000s now. So are you saying then that even without those underlying assumptions, you believe there's still going to be an impact? And if so, is it less than your $67,000 a year figure or not?
So what you're reading there is something I put together in June, and those are the numbers given to me by the company as the expected pilot agreement that they were working on at that time. So obviously things have changed since, and I'm not a party to those negotiations. So yes, it could be less. However, I have seen a very detailed spreadsheet of the investments the company's making, along with a schedule for 35 years showing depreciation of property, et cetera, and applying local tax rates to that assessment. And at a minimum, the smallest number I've seen is, instead of it being I think 2.35 million, it would be about 1.5 million that would be liable for property taxes because of new property in the county.
All right, in your report, did you factor in the direct and indirect economic benefits that would be lost from the agricultural jobs and those connected to it, businesses related to the agricultural end of things?
As you can see, that was not in the report that I wrote in June, and the subject of the lost agricultural value did not come up until about a month ago. And I have looked at that separately and made some sort of simple calculations, but it was not part of the filing that we did. I can address it a little bit if you like.
Is there is there any sort of written report or information that perhaps you could provide? Or is this just notes of yours?
There's no report. However, I have started looking at it since the question came up, and I could file some sort of statement if that helps you all.
Well, why don't you go ahead and summarize what you found out, and then we can determine whether we might want to ask for a further report on that.
Okay. So when this came up about a month ago, I started looking at agriculture data in the county and realized that this land, this farmland that is the site, accounts for about 0.5% of all farmland in the county and about 1% of all cropland in the county. So that gives you some perspective on how important it is countywide. Obviously, it's good farmland, and people are growing corn and soybeans on the property now. I made some estimates using, sounds like we have an echo. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm getting an echo. So I've made estimates of how much revenue that farmland would generate from corn and soybeans, and it's about a little over $500,000 a year. That translates into expenses of about that same amount, because on average, farm in the county are on average not making money. The average income is about equal to average expenses. So that amount of money would get spent on seed and feed and fertilizer and equipment. That's true. But you have to understand that most of that money does not stick to the local economy. It's spent at the local dealer, of course, but then the dealer has to turn around and purchase, primarily from out-of-state sources, seed, feed, fertilizer, equipment. So you've got to be careful thinking about this in terms of just how much the farm spends locally, because most of it does not stick there. It's probably, I think my estimate, I don't have it in front of me, but it was a little over $200,000 a year likely to stick to the Hardin County economy because of the expenditures by the 1,000 acres growing crops. There's another factor that no one's discussed, and that is what happens to the lease payments that go to the farmers that are leasing the land for the solar farm. The amount of the lease payments, I'm assuming, are confidential. I've not seen them, but they obviously have to be higher than what the farmer could get renting his land or her land for farming. that money, some of that money, we could estimate how much, also gets plowed back into the local economy, and that would be partly mitigate the losses from the farm expenditures.
All right, thank
So
you.
those are the basic things I've looked at so far. This is, I think, the sixth solar farm project I've analyzed in the last year and a half. It's the only one where the farm question came up, and that's why I didn't include it in the original study. But I'm happy to write something up if it helps people.
Thank you.
Deputy Secretary Lyons, do you have any questions?
I do not, Vice Chair, thank you.
Mr. Montgomery, any questions?
Yes, Vice Chair. Dr. Coombs, good afternoon. So I want to start with the difference between the 15.2 million in payroll and 312 jobs versus the 240 and 12 million payroll. I understand that there is a multiplier. Could you elaborate on what that process entails?
Sure. This is actually very standard input-output modeling. And so I purchased a M-plan model actually for all the counties in Kentucky. So I have 120 models plus a state model. And in the one for Hardin County, there are details for over 500 industries and how much each industry purchases from every other industry. So for the purposes of this project, there's a sector that's called something like new electricity and power generating structure, which fits the structure of this project. And so I simulated what 240 jobs in that sector would do throughout the economy. And so the model has intelligence about for these kind of structures, how much can be purchased locally as far as the supply chain versus how much has to be imported from outside the county. Obviously, the solar panels themselves and a lot of the equipment are not made in Kentucky. They have to be imported. But a lot of local things can be provided: earth moving, concrete work, landscaping, other services. And so the model predicts that the 240 jobs that year generates a total, an additional 72 jobs in the community for that year. That's not a large multiplier, but it's significant. If you go into, for example, as you know, in economic development, if you look at a big manufacturing operation, you can get employment multipliers in the range of 3 or 4, whereas this is more like 1.3. So, but I think it's valid, and the same thing holds for the payroll multiplier, and how we get from 12 million to 15.2 million. It's the same model, same process, same multiplier effects that we're predicting.
Thank you. I'm sorry, you cut out when you were finished. Okay, my next question revolves around the solar photovoltaic installer. You said that there would be, or in your report it says that you would expect there to be 3 installers. And is that based on the U.S. labor statistics, or is that based on another report?
So I don't have it in front of me, but I think I remember the Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes every 3 years detailed data on the number of people by occupation in the state and also their wages. And when I looked it up for Kentucky, those other occupations had data, but there was no data for photovoltaic installers. And so presumably, there's no history in Kentucky of that occupation. Therefore, there's no estimates for Kentucky. So I used a national number out of the same database to give a feel for how much they would make.
When you looked at that data, was that from 2019 or was that from 2020?
I believe it was 2019. It may have been, actually, the federal data may have been 1 year more current. I can't remember.
And I assume when you say occupation, you're referring to the SOC code, is that correct?
I'm referring to the standard occupational codes.
Now, I want to look at the property tax table in your report. I clicked the link that was on your report, and it took me to a dead link within the Department of Revenue's website. But just for clarification, you used the Department of Revenue's 2020 property tax rate book, is that correct?
That's exactly right.
And in the table, it says that the countywide tax is 98.0260 for real estate and 100.9574 cents per $100. Did you factor that by adding the countywide rate plus the public schools rate?
Yes. But in the table, I show the individual pieces and then add it up. And it works out, if you add the fiscal court, the schools, the libraries, all the other jurisdictions, it works out to about 1% for real estate and for tangible property, 1% of the value.
I guess I need to ask a follow-up or maybe give a little bit of an explanation. So I'm looking at the actual rate book, and under the soil conservation, per your table, it says 16.488 on real estate and 17.8787 on the tangible personal property. And when I compare that to the Hardin County rate book, I'm seeing 0.15 for soil conservation and 0.00 for tangible personal property, but that the county-wide tax is 16.488 and that the county-wide tangible personal property is 17.8787. Is there a possibility that you made a mistake there?
It's possible. I'll check it. I did download the spreadsheet and copy the whole table right into my spreadsheet and add them up, but I'll double check it and send you all a note if there's something wrong.
Sure, I'm looking at it and it's just saying that the total is 16.488. And so, sir, if you wouldn't mind to take a look at that, that would be great, because I would assume that now without a pilot/IRB agreement in place, that 2.35 million number is kind of a moving target. But obviously having the right property tax rates is a step in the right direction. So, in any event, that's all the questions I have, Vice Chair.
I will check that, but the projections of property taxes over the 35 years is in a spreadsheet that the company provided me, and I believe it has the correct local property taxes embedded in there. But anyway, I'll double check.
Thank you, Mr. Montgomery. I don't have any questions for this witness. Mr. Osterloh, do you have any redirect?
No, Vice Chair, I do not.
Okay. Does this witness wish to be excused?
Dr.
That'd be
Cruz?
good.
Okay, if there's no
Thank you.
objection from anyone, and I'm not hearing any, Dr. Coombs, you may be excused.
Thank you.
I know we're getting close to the end, we just have one more witness, but if it's possible, can we take about a 10-minute break before we finish up?
Sure.
Okay, let's come back at 3:55, if that's okay. We'll be in recess until then. Back on the record in case number 2021-00127. Mr. Osterloh, are you ready to call your next witness?
Yes, I'll actually turn it over to Mr. Gardner.
Okay, Mr. Kirkland, could you please raise your right hand? And do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct under penalty of perjury?
Yes.
Could you please state your name and address for the record?
Richard Kirkland, 9408 Northfield Court, Raleigh, North Carolina, 27603.
Thank you. Mr. Osterloh, you may ask your questions.
Your Honor, this
Mr.
is Jim
Gardner.
Yes. Thank you, Vice Chair. Mr. Kirkland, state your name, please.
Richard Kirkland,
And with whom are you employed?
Kirkland Appraisals, LLC.
And what is your profession?
I'm a commercial real estate appraiser.
And are you licensed in Kentucky?
I am.
And in approximately how many states are you licensed as an appraiser?
I think we worked out, was it 7 to 9 when I tried to list them off the other day. I've never really counted.
Okay. And how many states roughly have you done appraisals in, or how many solar farms have you examined?
I've done work looking at solar farms in 20 different states, and I've looked at over 850 solar farms.
Okay. And just as an aside, did you visit the solar farm, the proposed solar farm in this matter?
Uh-huh.
Okay. And as a result of your visit and your analysis, did you end up filing a report with the siting board?
I did.
And is that attachment number 6 to the site assessment report, to the best of your knowledge?
I presume it is.
All right. Can you summarize briefly your conclusions with respect to property valuation impact?
Sure. Based on the matched pair analysis, as well as looking at peer review studies and university studies, we conclude that the project as presented, if developed as presented, would have no negative impact, negative consequences on property values adjoining the solar farm. And we further conclude that this is a harmonious location for solar farms, and that this is where solar farms are located not only across Kentucky, but really across the United States.
Okay. And are you familiar with the evaluation of the site assessment report done by BBC Consulting?
I am.
And do you agree with the conclusions that BBC reached with respect to property valuation?
Yes, I agree with their conclusion of no impact on property value.
Now, a couple other things were talked about in the couple pages of the BBC report on property value changes, and one of those was the use of a person named Mary Clay. Do you agree with the use of Mary Clay's comments from another case in this case?
I don't believe that's appropriate. One, they don't necessarily have permission from Ms. Clay to do that, but furthermore, you really need a site-specific look at the site.
So each individual site matters, and a conclusion reached on another site, in this case, for example, it was a solar facility in far western Kentucky, that wouldn't be applicable to this one, is that correct?
Correct. You don't know what details that were of concern for her in those issues, as far as proximity, surrounding uses, a wide variety of issues that need to be site-specific.
Okay, so each is unique.
Yes.
And she didn't file a report in this case, did she?
Not that I'm aware.
Okay. Now, the BBC also gave a reference to a University of Georgia study. And do you have any particular knowledge of that study? And do you agree with the BBC conclusion from that study?
I'm familiar with that study and the progression of that study from when it started. Actually, was a graduate student study that Nino Avishad's was working on. I was actually an advisor and gave some feedback on the information on the property values in rural North Carolina, which is what that study looks at. There's some specific version of that draft or earlier version of that report that is cited in the BBC report is actually not the current state of that. They've filed a peer-reviewed version of that report that's been updated, the methodology has been updated, and it draws actually different conclusions from that first one that went through several layers of peer review before the final draft. The final version of it is now published and available, and it actually concludes on a positive impact on agricultural land value in proximity to solar farms.
Okay, so not only was it not negative as the original draft was, it indicates the final version that's published indicates that it's positive.
Correct.
Okay. Are you aware that at the public meeting earlier this week, that a person named Trina Martin, who is either, I'm not sure, a realtor associate or an associate realtor, criticized your matched pairs analysis?
I was made aware of that, yes.
Okay, and tell me what your response is to that criticism of your matched pairs analysis.
What I was provided with was just a small subset of all the total research I have in there. They pulled out 4 examples out of the 50-some matched pairs I have and wanted to focus on those. I would just say that comes across very much as cherry picking. My analysis includes examples that do show a negative impact, but they also show significant areas which shows positive impacts, and a vast majority of the data shows neutral impacts. So going through and picking out just the parts that tell you what you want and ignoring the rest gives you a distorted view of what's really going on out there. I think you need to look at the totality of the information and not just pick the parts you like.
And that would not be a professional approach to doing property valuation, is that correct?
No, that would not be the way to do that.
Okay. Early, and I think you were here on the, when there was public comment from Mr. Broderick, who is an attorney for certain landowners, and at the end of his comments, he indicated that the solar farm would devalue the land. Do you remember him saying that?
I did hear that.
Do you agree with that?
I do not.
Okay, and is that based on your study and just based on your understanding? Is that correct of doing proper valuations?
It's based on the information presented in my study as well as supported by the various university studies cited, other peer review appraisal reports done by other companies.
Okay, and one final question. Has the Kentucky Siting Board always accepted your conclusions?
I cannot necessarily speak to that. I'm not sure.
Okay. All right. Is there anything else you'd like to tell the Siting Board about your analysis of this property?
No, I think that covers it. I guess the only other thing I think was referenced as far as some of the public comments was regarding the University of Rhode Island study. And I would just stress that the findings of that study did show no impact in rural areas. And in fact, they stressed that the less population dense an area was, the less likely that there would be any impact. And the population density in this area is actually on the very low side, around roughly 60 people per square mile.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Mr. Kirkland is available for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gardner. Ms. Gosnell, do you have any questions?
Just a few. I was reading in your report, it looks like you sort of made a distinction in the data that's available for some of the smaller projects because you stated something to the effect that the larger projects are more recent, or most of the larger projects are more recent. Do you find that that there's a lack of consistent data on the projects of 100 megawatts or larger?
No. What's happened is my background again, I started looking at solar farms about 13 years ago. And in North Carolina, when solar farms first came through, the way the statutes were set up, essentially all the solar farms in North Carolina from that time period were 5 megawatts in size. Over time, not only has this been true in other states as well as North Carolina, but the size has increased as they've changed the way this works. The various authorities in charge of the power have decided that the smaller projects are not as ideal as the larger projects, and they've encouraged that shift. So the solar farms that are 10 years old are mostly smaller solar farms, but we have plenty of data to look at on the larger size of things. I would specifically point out like Spotsylvania and Virginia. We've got an extremely large site out there where we do have sales activity next to the solar farm, showing no impact on property values. And the follow-up to that is what we've also identified is even when you look at projects where you're looking at say a 70 megawatt, because we've had 70 megawatt and 100 megawatt facilities in North Carolina for some time now, you can see that there really hasn't been any significant distinction in the sales data for homes near a 5 megawatt solar farm situation versus a 70 or 100 megawatt. So we believe the data is consistent. The only real difference I've identified between the homes near 5 megawatt or homes near 70 or 100 or greater is that setbacks do tend to increase a little bit. At one point, the setbacks were typically around 100 feet or so, and now they typically are a bit further than that. And in the case of this situation, the setbacks are substantial and significant to protect property value.
When you were doing your analysis on the value of the adjoining property, were you assuming that property at its current use of agricultural or a combination of residential and agricultural?
Again, I looked at current and present uses, but at the same time, we did look at a mix of residential uses, and as long as the setbacks are far enough away, future development on those other lands should not be impacted. There are numerous examples that I could cite where new subdivisions are being built next to solar farms. We have a project in New Jersey that I'm looking at where they're building $1.6 million homes next to an existing solar farm that the homes are going in 200 feet away. So we've got a lot of data that does show that it does not have any impact on future development in the area.
All right, thank you. Those are the only questions I had.
Thank you, Ms. Gosnell. Deputy Secretary Lyons, do you have any questions for Mr. Kirkland?
Just one. Hi, Mr. Kirkland. Good afternoon. How, perhaps you addressed this in your report, but how does the recent boom in home prices factor into this versus historic data? How much does that skew it, or how's that taken into account in terms of your analysis?
Well, an interesting thing about that is I haven't found any relationship like I just cited in New Jersey, $1.6 million. I found multiple situations where I've got $1 million plus homes next to these solar facilities, and there's photos you can see from the back door of some high-end housing in North Carolina that's in my report. So the price point of the homes does not seem to be a significant factor. But what I will say is I do impact analysis and I do a lot of condemnation work unrelated to solar farm. And what we found over the last year, because in the area specifically right around me, the property values have been just kind of bonkers and going very high appreciation rates. What we found in that time period is when things are going up rapidly, what traditionally could be a negative impact, say a home too close to the highway, we found that those potential negatives when things are going up disappear. The demand for housing makes even small negatives, it just wipes them out. Because the demand is so high. So again, while my conclusion remains, I don't see a negative, even if you thought there was a negative there, or you wouldn't really find it in the rapid increases that was present in 2021 it's an issue not just for solar farm data, but any impact analysis I do with data from 2021 is it's not very reliable. But data prior to 2021 does provide good indications.
So your conclusion is that there's really no artificial, impacts by the current home market value, that would be assigned in this case here.
No, I would think that from what my experience has shown is that in this type of a market, that the opposite happens. That the demand just pushes things, and it's kind of makes even things that someone might generally would not prefer. It makes those folks reconsider what their real issues are, I guess.
Thank you, Vice Chair. That's all I have.
Thank you. Mr. Montgomery, do you have any questions for Mr. Kirkland?
I do not, Vice Chair.
Thanks. I have no questions. Mr. Gardner, do you have any redirect?
I do not. Thank you, though.
Okay, does anyone else have anything for Mr. Kirkland?
No, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kirkland. Mr. Gardner, Mr. Osterloh, do you have any additional witnesses?
No, we do not.
Okay. Just to close things out, I just want to make sure I have not screwed up. I did not note any exhibits proffered today that were not already in the record, and everything referred to is already in the record. Am I correct about that?
I believe that's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
And are there any other motions that I need to take up at this time?
Not a motion.
No motions. Although there were maybe 3 items that I have a note that maybe we're supposed to follow up with.
Well, that's what I was just about to say. Let's see, I've got 3 also. I've got the cumulative environmental assessment, either provided or show us where it is in the record. Any written reports or communications from the Fish and Wildlife people, and a verification of those tax table rates, and if they need to be amended, a corrected one. Is that what you've got, Mr. Osterloh and Madam Chair?
That's the same list for me, yes.
Okay. What we can do is, and we'll get to this in a second, we can have staff summarize these in the post-hearing order for you, and we can talk about a date here in a second for a response on those. Right now, when is the final order due in this?
March 6th.
Okay. When can we get a summary of those requests out?
I was thinking January 18 because the 17th is a holiday.
Okay. Mr. Osterloh, assuming you get those on the 18th, how long do you think you'd need to respond?
I mean, I think, especially because we know pretty much what's coming, I think it'd be a really quick turnaround. We could probably produce this by January the 21st, later that week.
Okay. Then we can put that in a post-hearing order. We'll get that out pretty quickly, and obviously you'll get those by the 18th. And I know you're a veteran of these cases. If you do wish to file a brief, that can be filed in accordance with the time that is stated in the statute. And we will get an order out to you all by March 6th. Is there anything else we need to take up today?
Nothing further from my end.
Anything else,
Nothing
Ms.
further.
Gosnell?
No, nothing further.
Okay, hearing nothing, then this hearing is adjourned. Thanks, everyone. You all have a nice evening.
Thank you. Thanks, Vice Chair.